May 1945. Europe was living through the final days of the Second World War. In the east, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. In the west, American and British divisions were advancing rapidly through southern Germany. Everything pointed to the approaching collapse of the Third Reich. The German army was exhausted. Communications were broken, and the cities lay in ruins. Yet, even as the end drew near, isolated units continued to fight, often without orders, driven by habit, fear, or desperation. It was within this chaos that one of the war's most improbable and nearly forgotten episodes unfolded. A battle in which Germans and Americans found themselves fighting on the same side. In the Austrian Tyrol, at the foot of the Alps, stood a medieval stone fortress known as Castle Itter. Built centuries earlier, it overlooked a small village of the same name, surrounded by forests and winding mountain roads. During the war, the castle had been converted by German authorities into a special prison. It housed high-profile French prisoners, former politicians, generals, and prominent figures captured during the occupation of France. Among them were former Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, General Maurice Gamelin, and other notable personalities. They were kept not for punishment, but as valuable hostages, bargaining chips for negotiations, should Germany's situation deteriorate. By May 1945, the garrison at Castle Itter was small, just a few guards from the SS. As news spread of Hitler's death and the Reich's collapse, panic took hold. Communication with Berlin had been lost, and no new orders arrived. Some guards fled, others tried to hide, and the castle was left largely abandoned. Inside the walls, the French prisoners quickly realized their predicament. They were free from direct control, but surrounded by danger. In nearby villages and forests, small SS detachments were still active, fanatical troops refusing to surrender, believing that death was preferable to defeat. These men considered captured officials to be traitors and valuable targets. If the castle fell into their hands, the outcome for the prisoners would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, American forces were advancing deeper into Tyrol. Elements of the U.S. 12th Army were moving toward Innsbruck, clearing roads of scattered German resistance. But the situation on the ground was fluid and confusing. Front lines no longer existed in any clear form. Units surrendered one moment and ambushed the next. For American commanders, every kilometer brought uncertainty. In the same region were remnants of the German 17th Division. Among its officers was Major Joseph Gangl, a career artilleryman who had long since lost faith in the Nazi cause. To him, the war was already lost, and further fighting meant only needless bloodshed. Yet Gangl was also aware of the danger facing civilians and prisoners in the area. Fanatical SS units were still roaming the countryside, and someone needed to stand between them and defenseless people. In the disintegration of the German army, Gangl faced a choice: to continue obeying orders that no longer made sense, or to act on his own conscience. As American tanks moved south and SS groups gathered in the mountains, the fate of Castle Itter hung in the balance. Inside its stone walls were several dozen French captives and a few civilians. Around them, disorganized German units drifted aimlessly, retreating or hiding. Every passing hour increased the likelihood of violence. Through local Austrian contacts, some of the prisoners managed to send word beyond the castle. One of the former guards, a Czech who had defected from the SS, volunteered to seek help. His journey through the devastated villages and forest roads would become the prisoners' final hope. Somewhere beyond the hills were advancing American troops, but reaching them meant crossing territory still held by German patrols and desperate stragglers. At the same time, American intelligence began to receive fragments of information about strange activity in the Tyrol region. Radio intercepts suggested that SS forces were regrouping in the mountains. Reports also mentioned a castle where high-ranking French prisoners were being held. The details were vague, but enough to attract attention. Commanders debated whether the location could be reached and whether a rescue was even possible amid the confusion of collapsing German defenses. By the evening of May 4, the situation inside Castle Itter had grown desperate. The French prisoners realized that without outside help, survival was unlikely. They had no real weapons, no military training, and only stone walls between them and the approaching SS detachments. In the distance, gunfire echoed across the mountains, a reminder that the war was still far from over for those trapped in its final chaos. Their only hope now lay in the courage of strangers, perhaps even former enemies, willing to defy orders for the sake of humanity. Within hours, a decision would be made that history could hardly have imagined. Germans and Americans, fighting side by side against the remnants of the SS, in one final battle of the Second World War. In the early morning hours of the 4th of May, 1945, the road to Castle Itter wound through quiet alpine valleys, broken only by the sound of distant artillery. Across Tyrol, German resistance was collapsing into confusion. Small groups of soldiers deserted or surrendered, while others, still loyal to the SS, vowed to fight to the last. Amid this disintegration, a single Czech guard from the castle made his way cautiously through the countryside, carrying a plea for help that would lead to one of the strangest alliances in modern warfare. After hours of walking and avoiding patrols, the guard reached the nearby town of Wurgl. There, he encountered remnants of a German army unit commanded by Major Joseph Gangl. Gangl and his men had broken from the Nazi chain of command and now focused on protecting local civilians from uncontrolled SS troops. They were, in effect, soldiers without a country too loyal to their honor to surrender to chaos, yet unwilling to fight for a regime that had already destroyed Germany. When the guard explained the situation at Castle Itter, French prisoners trapped and facing execution, Gangl immediately recognized the urgency. The SS units moving through the region were desperate and violent, and they would not hesitate to eliminate witnesses or prisoners. With limited manpower, Gangl needed outside support. He made a decision few could have imagined just months earlier. He would seek help from the Americans. In Wurgl, American tanks from the 23rd Armored Battalion, part of the 12th Armored Division, had recently entered the area. Among them was Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr., a young tank commander known for his initiative. When Gangl's envoy approached with a white flag, suspicion was high. But the message he carried that German soldiers wanted to join forces to save Allied prisoners was so unexpected that it demanded attention. Lee agreed to meet Gangl, and within hours, the two men came face to face. The meeting between Major Gangl and Lieutenant Lee was brief but decisive. Both understood the stakes: a castle full of high-profile prisoners, surrounded by hostile SS forces. Time was running out. Despite language barriers and mutual caution, they reached a simple agreement. The Germans would guide the Americans to the castle and fight alongside them against the SS. For the first time in the war, enemy uniforms would stand together for a shared purpose. The combined force was small, barely 24 American soldiers, a single Sherman tank, and around 10 German troops under Gangl's command. Yet their determination outweighed their numbers. Leaving Wurgl behind, they advanced cautiously toward Castle Itter. Along the way, they encountered pockets of resistance, but the reputation of the Americans and the unexpected cooperation of German regulars startled local SS patrols, allowing the group to reach the castle by late afternoon. Inside, the French prisoners were astonished. They had prepared for the worst, expecting SS reprisals or abandonment. Instead, they saw an American tank roll through the gate, followed by German soldiers who had come not as captors but as protectors. For a moment, disbelief overshadowed fear. The defense of Castle Itter had become a strange union of former enemies, united by necessity and a shared understanding of what humanity meant after 6 years of war. Major Gangl and Lieutenant Lee quickly assessed the defenses. The castle's medieval walls provided some protection, but ammunition was scarce. The single Sherman tank, positioned near the gate, became their main weapon. They distributed rifles to the French prisoners, though most had little experience in combat. The plan was simple: hold the castle until American reinforcements could arrive. By nightfall, scouts reported SS movements in the surrounding woods. The attackers were gathering perhaps 100 men or more, armed and desperate. They viewed the defenders not as soldiers, but as traitors and fugitives. The defenders prepared for siege. In the flickering light of lanterns, German and American soldiers worked side by side, reinforcing gates, setting up machine gun positions, and sharing ammunition. For Major Gangle, this was no longer a battle between nations. It was a last stand for honor and decency. For Lieutenant Lee, it was a mission unlike any other, a fight that transcended orders. Within the stone walls of Castle Itter, the last days of World War II were about to produce one of its most remarkable moments, a battle fought not for conquest, but for principle. The defenders did not know if reinforcements would come. They only knew that the enemy was near and that surrender was no longer an option. As the night deepened over the Tyrolean hills, the men waited in silence, listening to the distant rumble of engines. The next morning, the storm would break. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Austrian mountains on the 5th of May, 1945. Inside Castle Itter, the defenders, a mix of American tankers, German soldiers, and French prisoners, prepared for what they knew could be their final stand. The distant crackle of gunfire echoed through the forested slopes. The SS was coming. From the castle walls, lookouts spotted movement among the trees. Shadows of armed men spread across the valley, surrounding the fortress from all sides. The defenders numbered fewer than 30. Their opponents, members of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, outnumbered them several times over. Still, no one considered retreat. The first shots came at mid-morning. Bullets struck the castle walls, sending chips of stone into the air. The Americans returned fire from narrow windows, while Major Gangle's German soldiers manned positions near the main gate. Lieutenant Lee directed the defense, moving constantly between firing points. His single Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, opened fire down the approach road, scattering the first wave of attackers. For several hours, the SS troops advanced cautiously, testing the defenses. They were unaware of how few defenders held the castle, and the heavy stone walls made it appear far more formidable than it was. When they attempted a frontal assault, they were driven back by accurate fire from both American and German rifles, a strange unity that defied everything the war had represented. Inside the castle, tension mounted. The French prisoners, armed with captured rifles, tried to assist despite their inexperience. Some helped reload ammunition, others carried supplies. Among them were generals and politicians who had once led a nation. Now they fought side by side with soldiers from two former enemy armies. The irony of their situation was not lost on anyone. By early afternoon, the battle intensified. The Sherman tank had already taken several hits and was eventually disabled, its engine knocked out by an anti-tank weapon. The loss left the defenders with only small arms and limited ammunition. Yet morale held firm. The defenders fought not for orders or victory, but simply to prevent the massacre that would follow surrender. The SS surrounded the castle completely, cutting off any escape. Snipers took positions in nearby buildings, and bursts of machine gun fire raked the courtyard. Major Gangle, moving between positions, was killed by a sniper's bullet while trying to evacuate a civilian caught in the open. His death shocked the defenders, but also strengthened their resolve. The German soldiers who had followed him fought harder, determined to honor the man who had chosen principle over fanaticism. As the afternoon wore on, ammunition ran low, smoke filled the air, and the castle walls bore the marks of heavy fire. Communication with the outside world was impossible, and reinforcements had not arrived. Lieutenant Lee considered the possibility that they might not survive the day. Still, he ordered the men to hold their ground. Then, just as the situation reached its breaking point, the sound of engines rose from the distance, the unmistakable rumble of American armor. Scouts from the 142nd Infantry Regiment had finally picked up Lee's earlier message and were pushing toward the castle. Hearing the gunfire, they accelerated, crushing SS resistance along the road. When the first American reinforcements appeared at the edge of the valley, the SS troops began to falter. Within minutes, the attackers withdrew into the forest, leaving their dead behind. The siege was over. Inside the castle, exhaustion replaced tension. The defenders, Americans, Germans, and French alike, stood together in silence. The stone courtyard, blackened by smoke, bore witness to a battle unlike any other in the war. Major Gangle lay among the fallen, the only defender killed in action. That night, the survivors understood that they had taken part in something extraordinary, a final act of humanity in a world that had nearly lost it. The Battle of Castle Itter was over, but its meaning would endure far beyond that mountain valley. When the gunfire finally faded, silence settled over Castle Itter. The defenders, Americans, Germans, and French stood among the smoke and debris, realizing the impossible had happened. The castle still stood, and the prisoners were alive. The battle had lasted less than a day, yet it encapsulated the chaos, desperation, and strange unity of the war's final hours. The arriving American reinforcements quickly secured the area. SS stragglers fled into the woods, pursued by advancing troops. The surviving French prisoners were escorted to safety, many of them still in disbelief. They had expected to die in the last days of a war already lost for Germany, yet they had been saved by an alliance no one could have imagined. Major Joseph Gangle's body was carried into the courtyard. He had been struck by a sniper's bullet while rescuing an unarmed civilian woman during the fighting. For the German soldiers and civilians of Virgil, he became a symbol of conscience, a man who had chosen to protect rather than destroy. After the war, local residents honored him as a hero. His name would be remembered in Tyrol, not for battle, but for humanity. Lieutenant John Jack Lee and his men received commendations for bravery. Their defense of the castle, though small in scale, represented the spirit of cooperation that would define the rebuilding of Europe. For the Americans, the battle was one of the last they would fight in Europe. Only days later, Germany officially surrendered. In the broader story of World War II, the Battle of Castle Itter soon faded from attention. It was overshadowed by the fall of Berlin, the liberation of concentration camps, and the final surrender. Yet among historians, it remained a unique episode, the only known instance where U.S. and German soldiers fought together as allies. For decades, the event was mentioned only in passing in military records. Many participants returned home and rarely spoke about it. The French prisoners resumed their political lives, the Americans were reassigned, and the remaining German soldiers faced the uncertainty of occupation. The war ended, but the memory of that day remained quietly alive among those who had been there. In the years that followed, historians revisited the story. The details seemed almost unbelievable. A medieval castle turned battlefield, a mix of enemies turned comrades, and a joint defense against the remnants of fanaticism. Yet every report confirmed the truth. Documents, eyewitness accounts, and military logs aligned to prove that this improbable alliance had indeed taken place. Today, Castle Itter still stands in the Tyrolean Alps. Its gray stone walls bear no visible scars of battle, but its history is etched deeply into the memory of the region. Visitors who walk its halls learn of a moment when the boundaries of war blurred and humanity briefly overcame hatred. The story of Castle Itter reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can choose decency over destruction. In a world collapsing into chaos, a few men, German, American, and French, set aside everything that had divided them. They fought not for victory, but for life itself. The battle ended with only one defender lost, yet its moral weight endures. It showed that courage can emerge from conscience, and that unity can be born from conflict. The soldiers who stood together at Castle Itter proved that, even in the final hours of a world at war, compassion could still triumph over ideology. Long after the smoke of battle cleared, the echoes of that day remained a quiet testament to the possibility of understanding in the midst of destruction. The forgotten Battle of Castle Itter may have been small in scale, but in meaning it stood among the greatest of all victories.